Hello and welcome to Freedom's weekly news roundup. I'm Sam, UK editor for Freedom News. Um, we are joined by Rhiannon Firth, Andy Mink, and Simon, also of Freedom News. Um, and today we're going to be sort of talking about the last week's Supreme Court ruling on the Equalities Act, the marches that happened for it over the weekend. We will also be discussing the evictions, which have been going on in Greece and Brazil. Um, can't avoid talking about the Pope's death. That's, I guess, this week's big news story so far. Um, and if we've got time, we'll also go into the budget hole that Labour have found, as well as talking a bit more about kind of Labour and Starmer in general, being told that he needs to be more Trump-like in his media appearances. Um, and finally, the Home Office's decision to publish the nationalities of foreign criminals and what that means. Shall we start? Andy, do you want to? You've, I believe, read the entire Supreme Court ruling. So, do you want to give us a summary of that?
Well, 268 paragraphs, which incidentally is two more paragraphs than the number of popes there's been, which we'll come to in a little bit. Um, the To put the good spin on it, and I will talk about the judgment, and then people can talk about the social implications, is that the judgment doesn't say very much. The judgment is entirely restricted to interpreting the meaning of sex for purposes of the Equalities Act 2010. The only people who are affected by the judgment are those who have got a gender recognition certificate under the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, who thought that they'd officially become the other sex, but haven't, because the Supreme Court decided that the that when Parliament passed the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, they meant biological men or women, which seems, although they don't go on to define it, to be just what's on your birth certificate. Which, as if you haven't registered a birth certificate, you don't need any medical input. It's just the parents putting down what sex they think you are. So there's no science in the show at all. It's just um, and in terms of the knock-on effects, it's mainly about exceptions to sex discrimination. So there are certain things, and it is the provision of services that we're talking about that's particularly one. And the ones that will be most affected, that's really distressing, are things like um, women's refuges, whether trans people can access those. Um, but it's not. And the Supreme Court makes this entirely clear, paragraphs 25 and 26, about settling the social debate about what is a man or a woman. It is purely for those things. And some of these exceptions we'll come to a little later in the show, because one of them is religious organizations that can be as sexist as they like in choosing their leaders, or all of their priests. Um, so yeah, so it hasn't done as much damage as a ruling as we might think. It's what it's done socially, and people have run away with the idea that now only um, people who have been registered at birth as of one sex can go into that version of toilets. Now, just on that one, there's no powers for people to check who goes into toilets. They can't ask you to prove that you're a man or woman when you're using a toilet. And they've got no right to stop people from using whatever toilet they like. So that has not changed. And I wish that someone with a bit of political guts had gone out and said that to prevent the amount of fear and that has been created in the trans community of what might be coming up. Um, and again, as the Supreme Court points out, none of this in this judgment takes away the protections in the Equality Act from trans people. And indeed, they try to put a gloss on it, which I'm not entirely saying is working, but is from their point of view quite clear that if they had said that these protections only applied to people with a gender recognition certificate, which is less than 9,000 in the whole of Great Britain, then all the other transgender people wouldn't be enjoying those protections, and they do. And the Supreme Court makes it very clear that any discrimination towards people because they're trans is a breach of the Equalities Act 2010. So that's the good side. And now we can go and live in the fairy tale world of the Daily Mail, where, in fact, people will have to carry around proof of their birth gender in order to have a P.
So yeah, like it does seem to have been incredibly badly handled all round, really, the way in which it's been presented. I mean, obviously the likes of the Mail and the Telegraph and that are going to do their level best to misrepresent it as far as possible to push that particular agenda, and normalize it wherever possible. I mean, if you get to the point where, um, socially speaking, it's assumed that, you can't be trans and go into, um, the bathroom that you want to go into, uh, then you end up with, policing of people in the bathroom for looking too masculine, essentially. I can't see it being much fun for butch lesbians over the next couple of months to a year. Um,
Oh,
It's I mean, on the sort of subject of it not being kind of handled very well, it definitely one of the things that I found, I don't know, interesting, I guess, perhaps not surprising, but was definitely the political response to it by well, the Labour Party in particular, because their response to it doesn't seem to match what it actually says. Like, it's it's just it's just as you sort of said it, it's about sort of how the Qualities Act should be applied. It doesn't have any kind of further meaning, sort of beyond that in terms of like, it's not a ruling on how we should all now act as a society on this particular topic. And yet the Labour Party in particular, I mean, the Conservative Party where they were already, so that doesn't really make much difference. But Keir Starmer coming out and sort of saying, on the basis of this, I can now say that I do not believe that a transgender woman is a woman, which I think is exactly what he said, or at least what his spokesperson said on his behalf. But sort of linking that to the ruling is odd insofar as that, it doesn't seem to kind of connect. I mean, am I wrong in sort of finding that a kind of, like I said, not necessarily surprising, but definitely an odd thing to sort of say because it seems disconnected if you've actually read it.
it's 100% cover for Keir Starmer shifting his political position, right? Like, which I mean, Starmer's general trend has been, at the very least, to try and placate what he clearly considers, and mostly is, a far right organization running the US in any way possible. Um, like, in terms of the actual voting public, I think he's actually going further in terms of his politics, in terms of being, anti-trans, than quite a lot of the general public is. Um, but he's very much in the same trend as the government has been in for a long time as a whole, moving in a more reactionary direction. But there is also the consideration that, as we know, the US has been pressuring for Britain to showcase a more socially conservative aspect as part of trade negotiations. And this kind of, essentially public, um, demonstration, is it fits in quite nicely to that. Like it'll go down quite well in the trade negotiations, I have no doubt. That's a very cynical take, I accept.
No, it is very surprising how MPs have been cowed by the very vocal TERF minority to think that this is a issue that the public are so prejudiced on that they will lose votes if they stand up for trans rights. And it is incredibly disappointing when you look at other big social issues over the years on homosexuality, on abortion, on the death penalty, where MPs brought in legislation, even knowing that there were rabid vocal minorities on those issues against progress. And in particularly the case of the death penalty, there's still a majority of people in favour of the death penalty, and yet it was abolished in 1965. So the lack of gumption is really amazing.
I'm interested, like, what people think about sort of the idea of rights in general being, you know, from a state-centered perspective, being like bestowed upon these sort of rather abstract ideas of what an identity is, and then ultimately they're sort of pit against each other for scarce resources, and that being kind of constitutive of what statism is, I suppose.
I think
yeah, sorry.
Oh no, as I say, I think that's actually a very good. Like that's a point that's actually I think does tend to get lost a bit. Is obviously as anarchists, we have been sort of drawn into the kind of the argument on kind of like all kinds of like sort of human rights, which is a kind of at its heart quite a liberal kind of concept, and I kind of personally, the sort of the fight for anarchists, despite having that criticism of like the liberal, and sort of correct me if I'm wrong, but we've always had that criticism of kind of liberal notions of human rights, but yet sort of anarchists have always been at the sort of forefront of like the fights for free speech in the like 1920s and 30s, through to present, and sort of stuff like that. So for me, it's from a kind of pragmatic perspective, sort of a solidarity perspective, that kind of that fight, is allows people to survive who can then organize for kind of further, well, in our case, revolutionary activity. I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of always been my my view in a very broad sense, not just on that issue, but on kind of all issues when it comes to rights in general.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more often quite conflicted because I'd certainly never want to say that anyone's rights should be taken away. But on the other hand, to what extent should we be sort of fighting for these sort of quite rigid definitions of what constitutes one type of person or another type of person in the eyes of the law? And to what extent should we be talking about sort of trans expression and protecting people's right to express themselves in many ways and creating spaces to do that, I suppose, rather than their legal rights. And I suppose that's partly about social movements, which is one of the things we're going to talk about, isn't it? I think. I'm interested in how the movement, was that part of the same item or is it a separate item we're going to talk about today, the social movements?
Well, I was going to say, so I mean that yes, the other thing. So obviously, so in quite an impressively quick time, they in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling, various groups who I apologize, I can't remember off the top of my head exactly who they were, but several groups called a demo for emergency demos. The sort of big one out in outside Parliament. I think there was others in Cardiff and Edinburgh. I think I believe there was also in Brighton and possibly Bristol. Anyway, the point was, but there was a big one in Parliament Square, which was organised very last minute, very, very quickly, and yet the turnout was impressively big. It was I've seen sort of people saying between 15 and 25,000 of the numbers that I've seen from reports from a lot of people there. So as I understand it, and people can who might know otherwise can get in contact and tell me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is that Parliament Square has can fit about 12,000, 15,000 people in it. And the reports were that it was overflowing, which implies that it was definitely more than 10,000. And I can believe, sort of 15, 20,000 is an easily believable number given the pictures I've seen and what I've heard from people who were there. So, that it was impressive to see people organise so quickly and in such numbers, and that was just in London as well. Like I said, the demos around the country were, it was lovely to see that sort of solidarity come together so quickly.
It's one of the it's one of these goods and bads, in as much as rulings like this can be motivating for a number of different reasons for lots of different groupings, and it's and obviously you had the rather horrible spectacle of champagne corks popping outside the High Court on behalf of the campaigners who had won. But it also, there's a strong tendency across most of society, and it's heavily encouraged by the funneling of rights into legalistic avenues, or the funneling of how we are allowed to live our lives into legalistic avenues, that we think that the law is set and therefore we must wait for the law to do its business rather than being involved ourselves in concepts of justice, right? And it's only when these kind of shifts in the law happen, or these injustices, either perceived or real, take place within the legal context a lot of the time, that people will rediscover the idea that, actually, the guarantees of our safety, of our community having power and exercising it, have to be manifested in actively showing up and doing something yourself.
Does anyone have anything else to sort of say on this particular topic?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose the most frightening thing is it seems to have given people the confidence, people on the sort of gender critical side, the confidence to sort of say some quite awful things that maybe they wouldn't have before. I mean, that's one thing that I noticed on my social media timelines of people I knew that perhaps I wasn't aware had these views before, were suddenly kind of coming out with things, and I found that quite shocking, and I'm quite worried about that being something that's going to happen in my workplace, for example, or in other spaces. I'm quite worried about the ramifications of that, that viewpoint becoming more vocal, I suppose.
Yeah, that's as Andy said, kind of this is it's kind of quite a small kind of group of people, and I think it's the plurality of people just kind of don't care one way or the other, which is its own issue and sort of problem. But ultimately, sort of those people are kind of very much in a minority and a very vocal one, so it's definitely kind of quite concerning in a way that they've managed to sort of pull so much kind of power over the well, for lack of a better term, the kind of conversational. I don't particularly like that term. Cool. Shall we move on to the next topic then, which is the evictions in Brazil and Greece? Simon, do you want to give us a summary of that?
Sure. So in brief summary is that over the last, 15th to the 22nd, there were 3 evictions across various places in Greece. There was the most important, well, not the most important, but the most historic building was Evangelismos. I apologize if I mispronounced that, which is a long-standing squat, originally in a hospital in Heraklion in Crete, and that was evicted for the second time after it had been reoccupied following a previous eviction. There was also an eviction in Thessaloniki and also in Exarchia, which is the famous anarchist locality within Athens, abutting the Polytechnic building. And there seems to be one of the squatting collectives affected basically said that they're being attacked and or disappeared, in their words, largely because the state is starting to panic, because what had seemed a relatively small deal, which was its failure to act, corruption has been thrown around as a word, but inability to properly deal with a train disaster has been kind of folded into lots of other social aspects of social discomfort or dissent. And this has popped up as there's been an attack on the railways. There's also been large protests, and the state is clearly worried that this is going to metastasize into a revival of the major series of protests that destabilized Greece in the 2010s, late 2010s.
Brazil, there was something happening in Brazil as well, wasn't there? Another eviction. Is that?
That was the Teco Hor village. I mean, obviously, different continent, but this was the military police evicting them largely so that real estate could developers could come in and do their business.
Okay, so a different issue in there. Yeah, situation in kind of Greece is I think I've mentioned before on this that I don't know a lot about Greece, so I can't sort of say too much about it. But yeah, it's kind of, I do wonder if we'll sort of start seeing more of this kind of outside of kind of Greece, because yeah, there is that. It feels, yeah, it's sort of silly to think that as sort of things begin to, sort of societies and sort of, kind of governments in particular sort of do start to, sort of, the radical kind of groups do kind of sort of step up and sort of find more sort of traction. So it's sort of silly to think that the kind of state is not aware of the danger that, like we like to sort of, sometimes we like to overplay how much anarchists sort of contribute, sort of to sort of things, and sometimes we sort of joke about how ineffective we are. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, we do represent a sort of a threat to the state at various sort of points, and it does make sense in this particular kind of context that they would be doing that. So I do wonder, as sort of things across Europe do kind of continue to decline, whether we'll be sort of seeing that this sort of thing kind of happening kind of more, and find anarchists finding ourselves kind of more repressed than usual as a result.
I think one thing that's probably worth bearing in mind is that at the moment, dissent is to a great degree being funneled towards the far right, as we know, certainly in electoral terms, as the only electoral vehicle, really, that is presenting something. One thing that's probably worth bearing in mind, different from the status quo, right? Like they are presenting themselves as a method of getting away from failed neoliberalism and globalization. In Greece, this has kind of already happened, because obviously Syriza failed fairly dramatically, and New Democracy took over again on the promise that they would, stabilize everything. They would be much more hardline against the left, and that they would be strongly against more refugees coming in and all the rest of it. And they have implemented most of these ideas, right? But the problem is the corruption doesn't go away, right? The economy doesn't suddenly get better. People aren't suddenly finding themselves wealthier and more stable in their lives. And there's two ways that can go. Either you can kind of flip back towards the status quo, or things can start to kick off. And the status quo now in many places is so fundamentally unpopular, and particularly in Greece, where there is a history of things kicking off when things get that unpopular, that option starts to reopen, right? That direct action starts to become a much more sensible sounding alternative, I suppose.
Does anyone else wish to weigh in on this?
Positive
Um,
take though, Simon. I
I
like that.
like to try and inject a bit of optimism now and again.
um, and so I guess kind of going on to the Brazilian eviction. So that's land, was it land-based, did you say?
Yeah, so this is essentially sacred land. It's the village is made up of Guajajara, indigenous people from Maranhão, um, and it's on ancestral lands where they do essentially traditional growing practices, um, and they've been denied official recognition of their territory, and now it's due to be redeveloped, and they are resisting it at the moment. This is, I mean, obviously, the whole eviction of indigenous peoples from their lands is an ongoing, brutal process. I don't know whether people have got much history of the uh, disenfranchisement of indigenous people in Brazil. They've read up on.
That do you know if this is to what extent, is this like private sort of private companies with kind of private security or whatever doing this, or do you know how much of this is kind of linked to like sort of private enterprise and how much this is linked to the state?
I mean, the private enterprise, I mean, one in one hand, one in the other, right? Like TerraCap, which is the company, wants to redevelop it. The state wants wants a good chunk of money. If there were brand envelopes being handed across, I would not be entirely surprised. But yeah, like it's in the state's interests to promote development in general, particularly against already marginalized groupings that can't really defend themselves very well.
Mm. But, as you said, there's nothing particularly new here, sadly. Um, the I think it's important to note as well that this is under the presidency of Lula, right? Who has a lot on the left in particular, maybe not anarchists, but a lot on the left were very excited to sort of see his return. So I think it is important to sort of note that this sort of supposedly left-wing progressive is overseeing the kind of continued genocide of native people. This is he was that's something that it's important to say there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a man who was in part elected on a promise to defend indigenous people.
Mm.
uh, Practical matters, etc., etc.
Well, no. So I guess if anyone has anything else to say on that, we have the Pope has died. Um, yeah, so Pope Francis, interesting figure in regards to probably one of the most progressive popes there's been. I can't say that for certain because there's a lot of them going back almost 2000 years. But definitely the most progressive pope in living memory, let's say, uh, which, given the nature of the Catholic Church, is saying something. He was a Jesuit, I believe the first Jesuit Pope, and who are a Catholic order known for their charity work and commitment to the poor and fighting poverty and social justice. That being said, there's degrees of the extent to how progressive the Jesuit order is very dependent on sort of person to person. Some of them are kind of fans of liberation theology, and some of them are quite conservative. So, him being a Jesuit it didn't necessarily mean that he was going to be as progressive as he turned out being. I use the word progressive quite loosely there because, he was still quite socially conservative on quite a lot of issues. That being said, he was unusually I was trying to find my words and I want to say sort of non-judgmental, but that's not quite right. He was a big believer in it's God's place to sort of judge people, not ours on earth. Um, and so therefore we should be more forgiving of people who he may not have said it out loud, and sometimes he definitely did say it out loud, but who he considered to be sinners. LGBT people being the most obvious kind of category there. He also equally was not without his controversies in regards to the covering up of abuse within the church, which just given the sheer scale of it, I don't think anyone in any sort of senior position within the Catholic Church's hierarchy is particularly clean on that issue. Yeah, so anyway, he's died, and big question is who's next? Does anyone have any particular anything particular to say on this?
Okay, as many of my followers know, I'm backing Pizza Balla, because he's got pizza in his name, and that's about as good as you're going to get out of what we've got on offer. Interestingly, he was Archbishop in Jerusalem for a while, which and he has actually said some nasty things about the IDF and the wall. So that won't help him one little bit. But he is 12 to 1 when I last looked at odds checker. Um, oh, can't even remember who's favourite now.
Is it
Kier,
Tagley?
yeah.
Louis Antonio Tagley.
The Philippine guys, I think in number 2 place at the moment. Then I suppose we have Turkson again, who's most likely to be the actual Black Pope. But he was favourite last time, and the bookies got that very wrong. He's from Ghana. He's relatively conservative. He said some bloody dreadful things on HIV. But again, what do you expect? Probably the worst outcome is unsurprisingly Cardinal Burke, who's one a Burke, and two, he's American, and Trump actually wants him so that they can have an American Pope, which pretty much should rule him out. I'm glad to see his odds are drifting. Um, for people not familiar with the Society of Jesus, which is the proper name for the Jesuits, the only member that I'm very aware of is Aramis from the Three Musketeers, who becomes head of the Jesuits in one of the later novels. Funnily enough, the head of the Jesuits used to be called the Black Pope by English Protestants because of their evil machinations and sending agents to Britain to um, blow up Parliament, for example, which is one of the best of their plans. So they're not all bad. They do have a certain connections with some Fawkesian type activities in the past. So yeah, this will be Pope number 267. I'll put my heads up that we will never get as good a one as Benedict the Ninth, who numbering, by the way, for popes is the same as American presidents, so you can get more than one. Benedict the Ninth was Pope 3 times. He got thrown out once. He sold the papacy once, and for Pope number 150, he got thrown out again. At least he was gay, but not openly proclaiming it to be a good thing. Rather, it was an accusation levelled at him by his opponents for getting thrown out. But yes, I should try and turn the picture around so I can show my little chart of all the popes, which I got on my trip to the Vatican once. But yeah, so I have to fill in a new picture of whoever we get next. But if you all say an Ave over your dominoes tonight, there's a chance that Pizza Balla will romp home. So that's my take on the popes for what it's worth.
You know, I think treating it as fantasy, you can certainly do worse than just treating it as fantasy football.
I think there is a kind of question because I mean, of you know, as anarchists, yeah, the Pope is well, yeah, he's a authoritarian figure. He is literally the absolute monarch of the Vatican and the church and stuff. So there is that kind of question, but at the same time, he is the representative of uh 1.4 billion people, I want to say. Um, so it's kind of quite easy to dismiss him, and it's a lot of fun to take the piss out of him, and I would never say that we shouldn't be doing that. But at the same time, there is that kind of, I mean, very similarly to the first thing we spoke about, the cultural sort of side is something that does need to be kind of considered, and you know, I kind of like there's a lot to criticize about Pope Francis. I think then there's a lot that should absolutely be criticized and stuff like that. But I do think it's kind of like once again kind of quite interesting to sort of think about the kind of cultural impact that he kind of has. Like he has led a reformist sort of charge within the kind of Catholic Church. And in a time where we are seeing this sort of increased authoritarianism and this sort of move towards kind of autocracy, I don't know, there's a sort of weird irony in the fact that one of the most autocratic sort of entities on the planet is or has been one of the few kind of bastions of um I don't know, positivity is not the word I am looking for, but like, he was loosely advocating for kind of more collectivist and or communal, I should say, communals rather than collectivist, more communal kind of ways of sort of doing things. He was, kind of preaching about kind of community, which is something that anarchists obviously are, sort of also sort of interested in. So there is, that it's interesting to sort of think about that kind of impact, I guess, without necessarily defending, sort of him overall. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I mean, obviously, if you look at, if you compare him to Ratzinger, right? Like Ratzinger is just on as far as Catholic politics goes, Ratzinger is on the other side of the coin, right? He's the other example where you can point to him and say, the man wandered around in his expensive red shoes and his big throne and all the rest of it. He loved his bling, and he was famously a hammer against liberation theology.
Mm.
And he's and the one of the things obviously about any figure in power is that you or they have to make accommodations with every other aspect of power, right? And this is something which obviously Trump himself is finding, or has been finding over the last couple of months, is that he keeps coming up with, I demand that this happens, and then realizes he hasn't got the power to do that because he has to make accommodations with everybody else who has power, and then ends up, either rowing back on stuff or coming to an accommodation or whatever. And Ratzinger, his accommodation with power was one which fully embraced the idea of aggressive capitalist accumulation of wealth, like on a global basis. Like he had he kind of said the words in terms of Catholic ideals around that kind of subject, but his position was quite clearly not as confrontational on the subject as Francis was. I mean, Francis was weak confronting his own team when it came to sexism, when it came to LGBT rights. And that's partly because, he is ultimately a Catholic, and that is ultimately the Catholic viewpoint on those subjects. And it's, you can't be the Pope and not be the Pope under those circumstances. But his accommodation with wealth was, as far as these things can be managed, critical, in some cases highly critical of accumulation and wealth, this kind of gospel of prosperity type stuff that has taken hold across certainly America and most of the West, really, and against the individualism and such like. Which, I was watching a senior trade unionist on Novara Media the other day saying, well, this is also part of being the Pope, but absolutely it wasn't a serious part of Ratzinger's perspective, right? So there is, as far as all that goes, I think he's, it's a really strong example of how, when you're on the right, someone like Ratzinger can just allow, he finds it much easier to make an accommodation with power that allows whatever he wants to take place because it fits in with what power wants. Francis struggled because he was not, what he wanted didn't fit with power. So his accommodation was a deeply uncomfortable one. And this is, we were saying in a column on the subject yesterday, this is an anarchist critique, right? Like, anarchism is not just about saying whoever's in power is automatically evil and whoever's in power is has all this incredible ability to do wrong, which they can, right? Like, power can be misused by kings and politicians and ministers, but it also isn't a means by which we progressive forces can change the world, because it's not set up like that. It's always this accommodation with power.
In Ratzinger's defense, I've got to say that he was very militant on climate change, being the only Pope I know of actually trying to shoot down planes when he was in the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. But he was very reactionary. And in fact, although he was not Pope for very long, he was John Paul II's right-hand man for about 20 years and pretty much running the scene while John Paul went around kissing the tarmacs of the world. All the bureaucracy was set up. And Francis has done a hell of a lot to try and get some new blood in, which may prove beneficial. About 80% of, I think, 138 cardinals have the vote. You get excluded from the vote when you're over 80 in a radical change. Actually happened before him. But so there is some hope that there might be a more progressive type this time. But to be said, more progressive popes don't tend to last long. John the 23rd was pretty good. He managed about 5 years, and John Paul I, they bumped off in about a couple of months, as I recall, in mysterious circumstances yet to be explained.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone saw, but I think it was J.D. Vance, who is a Catholic convert, I believe. I say recently, earlier this year, I believe. Well, he got into a bit of an argument with Rory Stewart, ex-Tory MP, over a kind of obscure bit of Catholic doctrine, which I won't go into. But the Pope, about a month or so ago, sent a statement, or whatever, to the church officials in the state, where it, not so subtly came out and said that JD Vance was wrong, and in his interpretation of that. In fact, actually, it probably is quite important to say what it was. It was over the kind of concept of kind of Christian love, JD Vance said that the most important love is between a family, and then between like your kind of community, and then the sort of state. And there's levels of love which, you know, sort of importance. And the Pope, in his rebuke, said that Catholic love is sorry, or well, yes, Catholic and Christian love is universal, and you can't prioritize certain kinds of love above others. Anyway,
Catholic in direct translation.
oh, yes, indeed. And anyway, JD Vance was kind of, you know, pretty much directly criticized by the Pope in that sort of subtle, not so subtle way. But I think it was the day before he died, JD Vance visited the Pope in the Vatican. Um, am I saying that those two things are linked? No, not at all. Am I implying it? Yes, absolutely, I am implying it, but I am definitely not saying it. I am, of course, joking. I want to make that clear. Okay, cool. Shall we move on to Labour's brand new budget black hole?
Yeah.
Does anyone want to introduce that? Owen?
Sure. So, I mean, essentially, the Office for National Statistics has announced that UK government borrowing has risen an extra 15 billion on top of what had been forecast in the last financial year. This has been blamed on a number of factors. This includes the tariff situation and also basically higher costs to service government debt, which has already risen to relative historic highs of just under 100% of GDP. But it essentially more than wipes out the fiscal headroom much vaunted that Rachel Reeves had set for herself and makes it, unless they raise more taxes, makes it almost impossible for them to fit within her fiscal rules, self-imposed fiscal rules.
Well, what good spin can we put on that? It might stop them buying more tanks and planes and bombs, unless they cut the age budget again. But apart from that, I can't think of anything optimistic on that one. But isn't it sort of inevitable that this, as with Trump, is bringing about a global economic catastrophe with his tariffs, which he told us about. We got the promise that he was going to wreck the world economy. People are just a bit surprised that he's doing it. And for any incoming government to plan on things being the same as usual from any point after November of last year was just wishful thinking, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's whether this will break the dam on the whole wealth tax thing, which obviously has been gaining a bit of traction in the last while, is possibly an interesting question. I think obviously there is the extreme level of reluctance of a new Labour government to start taxing the rich, just on an ideological level. But there's also the factor that a lot of the teeth has been taken out of the argument recently that the rich are just going to abandon ship if taxes start to be raised on them. And this is partly because tariffs are going to go up everywhere. And Trump has, far from encouraging the rich in the US with his varying arbitrary measures, seems to have spooked quite a lot of them, because there's been articles going up about how there's been an influx of American interest in moving to the UK as a relative safe harbor from whatever ideas Trump decides to get into his head next time. And this would tend to reinforce what has been a left-wing argument, which is the whole thing about people moving en masse is kind of overblown, right? So So there is a subset of the rich who are highly mobile and who came to Britain in the first place to take advantage of its low tax opportunities, right? The Mittal and all that lot. But most of the people who live in Britain, and most of the people who will be moving from the US as well, they're here as much for cultural and social reasons as they are for anything to do with tax or whatnot. And it's actually quite hard to up sticks entirely if you're not used to it and move across the world into a situation which may also not be terribly stable given the circumstances. Which, yeah, it seems to weaken the case against redistribution from the rich under these circumstances.
Does anyone else have anything to add on this topic?
I mean, what's the anarchist perspective on it? I'm not sure. I'm clear on what specifically anarchist about what we were just discussing about sort of labour and redistribution and the rich. What should anarchists think or do about it?
I mean, I suppose it's one where the anarchist position is not that far removed from a more reformist one, in as much as like we know that a pressure is going to be applied to labour sort of now and down the line in terms of what it has a budget to balance, and it's going to try and do it in one way, and we're going to be needing to try and avoid them doing so, I suppose.
As in,
I mean, sorry,
I'm not sure I understand. So, should we be organising against austerity or something, or is there anything to be said for how anarchist groups or movements ought to be, what in this should they be organising for, and in what ways, I suppose?
I mean, I think that I mean everything kind of regarding the UK economy in particular, but also the kind of global economy does sort of I mean we've already started down that path towards sort of further entrenching kind of austerity as the sort of status quo. So the anarchist response, at least in my mind, should definitely be we should be organizing harder than ever. I mean, I guess like or continue organizing, but I think the kind of austerity is just it's gonna be more cuts, which kind of is going to result in sort of more kind of sort of alienation of sort of people in general and sort of stuff like that. So one of the things that sort of works best in our favor has always been our ability to base our kind of organizing around community, I think, and anarchists in particular, and sort of the solidarity that kind of comes out of community. And I think this links, this kind of links back to pretty much everything that we've spoken about so far. Sort of in the face of this, like this is just kind of capitalism is struggling, failing, whatever you want to sort of say about it. And it's things definitely seem to be getting worse. Like I kind of find it very hard to sort of say that it's just kind of situation as normal. I think it does very much seem that things are getting worse. So sort of stepping up our efforts to kind of get out into community, talk to people, set up mutual aid groups. We don't need a pandemic or a sort of an emergency to be setting up mutual aid groups. Mutual aid groups should be a standard thing that anarchists are constantly sort of setting up, so that the mutual aid group is there to provide mutual aid when everything collapses rather than after everything kind of collapses. That's what we should be doing. And I think this is my sort of and I think I don't think anyone would find that particularly controversial, but once again, as I sort of said with sort of Lula in Brazil and sort of his attacks on indigenous stuff like that, the Labour Party have no matter how much the left in general sort of pins their hopes on sort of the Labour Party to provide some kind of at the very least, from a more radical perspective, provide a progressive pillow, which we
like
can
universal basic income or something.
yeah, like these are all these are all things that we can sort of that we can expect, no matter how kind of realistic that kind of is. But like at the end of the day, that these issues will never be more than sort of plasters, and you know the likelihood of them actually providing these sorts of things are very, very unlikely anyway. Like any attempt for even like a sort of a radical a meaningful a Labour government that could actually provide meaningful change, the elite won't allow that to happen, and we have sort of seen that. I mean, Corbyn wasn't particularly necessarily all that radical, but he was definitely the most radical attempt the Labour Party, or like the Labour Party has had uh, at sort of kind of getting sort of that kind of level of progressivism into sort of power, and it was sort of stamped out, and that was relatively kind of not not all that kind of controversial sort of social democracy. So we can't pin our hopes on things getting better in that regard. So sort of anarchists should be out there organizing in kind of communities and sort of sort of doing mutual aid. Like economically things just they're going to get worse, and we need to provide something positive that people can see and say, hey, they seem to know what they're doing. Maybe, and there's something to this anarchism business. Anyway, does anyone else want to say anything on that? Shall we move on to the next subject then, which, oh, well, on the subject of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer being told to be more kind of Trumpian. I don't know if there's much, you know,
I mean, yeah, I mean, sort of all of these are sort of the last three are all kind of they're not specifically anarchisty, but they are kind of indicative of the direction that the Labour Party is going to take in the next while, and it's worth kind of being aware of this in terms of how we make our arguments to the general public, I suppose.
So I
So
guess, sorry. So the other one being the Home Office is to publish the nationalities of foreign criminals. So I guess if we're going to sort of tie all those together, it would make sense to sort of
yeah, I mean with Starmer, so I picked this one out, and it was primarily a pointer in terms of on the one hand, the whole story is ridiculous because Starmer is not Trump. He cannot perform in a media sense in the way that Trump
So
does.
who told him to be more like Trump?
Labour insiders were the ones who were named or not named in this particular case. It's a Guardian story. It says one minister said, so take that how you like. But the idea being that Labour want Starmer to be out in the media more, explaining why Labour's policies are great. But actually, this whole
I mean, he did come out and say trans women aren't women randomly, like you said, without being, asked.
yeah,
Maybe
this
maybe
is
that's more like Trump. I mean, that's the kind of sort of, random, uninvited take that Trump might come out with, I suppose.
I mean, yeah, maybe that's his take on it.
I
But
mean,
yeah, like sorry.
sorry. I
No.
was saying, well, reading between the lines a bit, I'm wondering, sort of, this sort of more like Trump. I mean, is this, there's presumably there's a reason why this bit of information was leaked. But is this, this an attempt? Is this the kind of Labour Party sort of trying to attempt to kind of move towards a more populist position?
To a point, I think a lot of it is just that the Labour Party is not really. It doesn't have a strategy, like a really well-honed strategy. So it keeps trying to magpie things it thinks that it sees working. And Trump televising all of his stuff and constantly explaining himself to the cameras works quite well for him with his support base. So they think, well, maybe Starmer can do this without taking into account that Starmer is a charisma vacuum who, with no ability to coherently or engagingly describe the things that he's trying to achieve, and the things that they're trying to achieve are fundamentally unpopular in a way which these policies are dull technocratic solutions to insoluble economic problems. They are not, appeals to the ideological heart of a section of society in the way that Trump is doing. It's from Labour's. It's a really good example, actually, of Labour's inability to understand what makes popular politics. And from our perspective, that's quite a useful thing because they're just really easy to knock down, right? Like you can sit for 5 minutes and say Labour is no different from the Tories, and what we were saying all along about getting them elected as the lesser evil. This is it, folks, right? Like they're just chasing Trump and co around and around, looking for a thing that will make them popular without ever having to challenge in any way the problems thrown up by their own politics.
I mean, Corbyn was sort of said to be quite populist at the time, wasn't he? So sort of symbol of left populism. Because I mean, surely populism is about appealing to the masses, but on the basis of what your ideology actually is, rather than it's like how can a left populism or a Labour populism or anything take any inspiration from Trump? Because it's just a complete contradiction, which of course is what Labour is, but it just how is that populist? How is it a sort of representing anything that the Labour Party or anything to do with in a way?
Absolutely. It stacks up particularly badly against something like reform, right? Where like whilst reform itself is going to struggle, I think, to get above its 24%, I think it's been hovering around, because that is a natural top limit for what its ideology is. That ideology as such, the kind of old-fashioned patriotism, anti-woke, yada yada yada, with a side of hating migrants and kind of hating Europe and being a bit Anglophile. It's recognizable, and it is an ideological position that has been built up by a section of British society. Whereas, yeah, as you say, Labour doesn't have any of that. Labour isn't appealing to its original core vote. It's not appealing really to centrism even at this point, because it's chasing so many politics, so many policies which are on the far right rather than on the kind of the liberal or liberal right even. And kind of trying to present yourself in a populist way when you're in that position, having self-squeezed yourself out of having an ideology.
Yeah, I mean, there's no connection to a popular social movement, really, which is the definition of populism, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, from our perspective, it's kind of helpful.
It's not what they think is popular. On the prisons one, at the moment, we have a demand by the prison officers associations to hand out the stun guns. And if they give all screws a taser, that costs a little bit of money, but you can work out that maybe you can sack half the screws because you don't need as many to restrain the lags if they're all zapping them. And they may just seize on this as an economic measure. And having had to already have a big let people out of prison thing, which they've managed to an extent to blame on the previous government, they are now desperately looking with policies like this, let's name the foreign prisoners ones, for some way to grab what they think that most people are worried about. Because if you ask them once, people will say, oh, the prisons are too soft, the courts are too lenient. But it's not something people will have anything other than an instant reaction opinion to. It's not what people are going to change their vote on. It's not what people are going to. It's something that they moan about. It's not like the good old days in the pub. But for for Labour Party having no real beliefs at their core, it's a matter of seizing whatever was last in the paper and trying to turn that into some money-saving thing that can be sold as a good idea by the spin doctors.
Mm. So setting aside the sort of populist sort of side of this for a second, the thing that I find kind of curious is, I mean, a lot of these things sort of are kind of, I mean, bringing it back to Trump, it's like, are echoing, uh, well, echoing Trump and like, American sort of talking points, which, is something you don't, it's not just Labour who are doing that, the Conservative Party are definitely doing that. And once again, sort of even, sort of Reform and Farage have tried that. Farage has sort of, as far as I can tell, has sort of stepped back a bit because, you know, the one of the first things you notice about kind of England is that it's not America, and like these these talking points may work really, really well in the States, but ultimately the issues may be similar. Like, sort of immigration may be a kind of an aspect, an aspect of continuity between the kind of right-wing politics of the States and of England. But like the way we kind of think kind of and sort of operate culturally is very different from the States. And, sort of, a lot of, even quite right-wing people see Trump as being kind of very brash and sort of stereotypically kind of loud American, and as such kind of look down on him. So this idea that sort of Starmer and just sort of like, sort of politics in general should be more American in order to appeal to the kind of, man on, sort of Peckham High Street or whatever, is I find that kind of quite odd because, you know, by and large, Americans just aren't very kind of popular, and the way they go about things is sort of not all that popular. So like that, this idea that that should be aped is kind of, it doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be an obvious vote winner. Cool. Has anyone else got any more to say on that, or shall we call that a an evening?
We're getting to the, well, we're past the hour, in fact, so probably about time to wrap it up, I would have thought.
Well, brilliant. In that case, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week.